but nonetheless, can I introduce Matt Jarratt from Procure Plus, who's going to give us his presentation on State of the Nation, all being well on procurement. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Russell. I've been sat with Russell having lunch, talking about how great the speeches were this morning, so I'll try and follow that on and warm up for Liz and Tony, who are going to be after me. So, I'm Matt Jarratt. I'm Assistant Director of Operations at Procure Plus. What I wanted to talk about today was a little bit about who we are, just to put into context why I'm here talking about the state of the nation, as Russell said. I want to talk a little bit about the strategic challenges that our customers are facing and are talking about in their procurement, and then go into a little bit of detail around the actual procurement challenges, talk a bit about the supply chain, what we're seeing in our interactions with the supply chain, what we're seeing with contractors, a little bit about fleet, and then everybody's favourite subject to really switch you all off, which will be a little bit on the Procurement Act and the changes that I think will affect you guys in the room. So, starting off just with a little bit about Procure Plus, who we are. We're a nice picture of us all in a spot in Wythenshawe in South Manchester. So, we're a not-for-profit organisation who basically put routes to market in place for social housing providers. So we have a range of framework agreements and we have a range of dynamic purchasing systems that social housing providers access to get as a route to market to get different things from the market. Now, we were set up about 18 years ago now around the Decent Homes One. So about 10 housing associations in the northwest of England got together and said, well, actually, rather than us all going out to market individually, let's aggregate our demand and let's all work together so we can get the economies of scale and we can work together to procure our Decent Homes programme. And it was only ever envisaged to carry on for about those first 4 years. We did those 4 years, and the housing associations we were working with said, this works really well, we're getting some really good deals, we're starting to work, and we then expanded it and widened it out, and we now do lots of different frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems, all in housing and all in planned investment and responsive investment works. So, just a little bit about Procure Plus and what I want to talk about. This year we're going to turn over around £210 million worth of activity. Now that's the procurement activity that we're running. We work with 106 social housing providers across the country now, and we work on around 600 call-offs a year. Now the important bit with that is we're interacting with the market 600 times. So every time we go out to market, we're learning a little bit more, and we're using that learning and value that we can then add to the next customer, and it's that constant evolution of what you do in the specifications, how you're working and how you're interacting with the market that gives you that knowledge to be able to improve, get the efficiencies and work differently as you go forward. This year we'll do around 32,000 property handovers, so again different types of works within those properties, 3.8 million responsive orders. And on the back of that, that procurement activity and that £210 million, we work with people who are distant from the labour market. So the Procure Plus name came from, we'll do the Procure, which is about getting the efficiencies, getting the savings. And from that activity, we should then be able to drive and make a difference in local communities. So this year, we'll get 720 people who are distant from the labour market, from our customers' communities into employment. And we work with local employment groups around that to make a difference and really see how that works. So the last thing really on that one, all that activity, there's a little bit there called launch control. We then developed our own in-house systems that basically take that data, and we can then use that to understand those transactions, work with the supply chain, work with the contractors and do things a little bit differently. And the final bit on that slide is we did win the Queen's Award, one of the last ones before it'll turn into the King's Award, for the work on that social value and those 720 people. And it's the second iteration. We're one of the only organisations who've got it twice as we've gone forward. So, talking to that's basically just an introduction around that exposure, and we do that by working with housing associations, councils, contractors, the supply chain and everybody to understand the market and understand what's going on. What are the challenges that we're seeing when we're speaking to the chief execs and the directors within organisations? They're looking at their assets and the value of those assets and the viability of those assets and starting to pick out the work around what do we need to do as our asset management strategies to get that with the borrowing market to get the better deals that are out there and in place. Now, when we started off, it was very much around working with contractors on the decent home stuff. And over the last few years, we've all seen the changes in demand and the changes in types of works that are being included in the asset management strategies. So it's moved away from that decent homes and it's moved into retrofit works over the last couple of years with the funding that's coming in, the Socialising Decarbonisation Fund and the various other mechanisms, the HUG, the lots of mechanisms that are out there. We've seen that demand shifting and more people carrying out retrofit works. We've also seen on the terrible fire that happened at Grenfell, we've seen building safety works being brought into the mix. And asset management has very much been around. We're not just improving the basis of those properties, we're looking at all the different elements. How can we retrofit? How can we improve the building safety? We're also starting to see data being used more. I think we can all agree that we've been data rich for quite some time and we haven't used it in the ways that we can when it comes to developing our asset management strategies and our actual details of what we're doing. So we're now seeing more and more software packages being brought in, and a lot of it's more around you've got data in lots of different systems that doesn't always talk to each other, and what can we do with that data? Can we pull it together? You know, we all talk about AI and the different technologies that are available now. Can AI look at your reactive activities and actually start to build trends up? When we look at damp and mould, if you're looking at 5 or 6 calls to a property, can that be collated into a planned programme? And we're speaking to more landlords now who are saying, well, actually, some of the reactive stuff I want to turn into planned programmes. I want to take more in-house, or I want to bring more external contractors in. And we're seeing a mix across the board with that. But we're definitely seeing a change with data-driven solutions are really starting to create those asset management strategies. And that move from responsive to planned is something that a lot of people are really keen on, but you do need to collate that data and turn that into a meaningful programme, because otherwise you're going out to market with bits that won't necessarily get you the best returns that you possibly could get. So let's move on to the sort of procurement challenges that we're seeing. And the supply chain, and I wanted to base this back. We all talk post-COVID, and what have there been the changes on the supply chain? And I think you have to go back to that post-COVID or the start of COVID to say, what has happened with price, what has happened with availability? Now, and that's why I've defined it as the perfect storm. When we're working with the supply chain, we have a look at the costs that are, the supply chain are feeling. How are those costs affecting the price that you were then seeing? And how do we do that? Well, we look at what is the product made of? What is the product made of? What is happening to cost of those elements that it's made of? How is it made? You know, we look at stuff like roofing where you've got really high energy requirements, and when the price of gas goes up, that starts to affect those things. We look at where is it made. There was some interesting issues that we had when we started off with COVID, that we had shipping containers that were being left in fields in France full of bikinis. And that was because everybody got into lockdown and the demand all of a sudden for all these items that had been made and were being shipped disappeared. So what they did was they just hid them away and put them in places. That, though, when as the market starts and when we started seeing that activity, just meant that you couldn't get hold of any shipping containers because they weren't going to empty them into the field in France or wherever it might have been. They left them there until the market picked up and they started to. So that affected the shipping container prices and how many people want it. So we had this drop where there was no activity, and as soon as it started back up, there was massive activity in all the different areas, and how many people want it, that demand became massive. And what this did was, it meant that all of a sudden, we speak to suppliers all the time to say, what's your justification for changing your price? And they'll say, well, I've got a price increase in timber, and my product has got 30% timber. And we'd usually offset that to say, yeah, but the price of the shipping containers where you're getting it from has gone down, the price of the other elements of it. What we found post-COVID was that perfect storm, everything went up across the board. So there were justifications for the supply chain to be able to have those price increases. So we saw that for a period of time. And then over the last couple of years, it started to slow down. So where we're at now, that's just really to set the scene around what the supply chain has been doing. And I think I was going to do you loads and different commodity charts around all the different elements, but I thought I'll just summarise it in a few here. So if you look at the chart in the top left, top left, yep. And that's on steel. So what you looked at, and this is just what I was describing, the market was quite clear, it was quite static, it went up and down, and then it had this huge spike because the demand was huge, everybody wanted steel items, the shipping costs were up, all the things were meaning that those prices went up to that point. So that went right up there, and that was the point when everybody was coming to you saying, we can't sustain the prices that we've got, we're going to have to look for price increases. What's happened over the last year or so is those prices have started to come down. And that steel one there is a good illustration of it, that it went up, and you won't be able to see the actual dates on it, but sort of towards the end of 2022, that was when we got to that top point where everybody was asking you for prices, and those prices were justifiably going up. We've then started to see that drop down. And when you look at all the commodity prices, it's a similar type of story. So you look at timber, you look at copper, you look at plastics, and they went up to that point, and then they started to come back down. Now, I'll guarantee that everybody in the room isn't going to be saying, yeah, they've all been coming back to me with price reductions because of all their costs coming down. And that hasn't necessarily been the case. But what it has done is it's reduced the increases that people have been asking for. So over the last 6 months, we've seen very few price increases because those costs have started to come down. It's not come out very well on the slide. The one on the multicoloured one is the energy price. And again, it's just to show that illustration, again, we had those peaks that were coming through at 2022 into 2023. They've started to stabilise. You've seen on the news now that pricing is changed when it comes to gas. The energy price cap is coming down by 15%. It's forecast to come down by a further 10%. So again, the stuff that has a high energy consumption when you're making it, the roof tiles, the glass, those types of items, their costs are starting to come down too. The other bit that I've put in at the bottom, and I've lost the bullet points, so I have to remember what I've put in hidden behind it, is that shipping container. And that just illustrates what I was talking about. Shipping containers went up to a ridiculous price when everybody wanted them and there was loads of activity with it. It's dropped down to pre-COVID prices in the sort of 2023. However, you can see that little spike at the bottom, and that is one of the items that I'm going to talk about now. So basically, the general gist of it is prices all went up, but they have started to now come down. And what we're now starting to see is the supply chain talking about that. And that has meant that prices haven't come down to you, but the prices, any increases have really started to slow down. And what we're now starting to see is there's individual items or individual spikes that are coming across. And that's what the supply chain are then saying to us at times. Oh, well, we've got a big problem now. So the bullet points you can't see that I'll remember. One was the Houthi rebels. You've probably heard about that in the news. Shipping lane in the Red Sea. They've been going at different vessels, and that's been a problem. So what we've seen is a lot of the supply chain is telling us we're actually rerouting that, so we're not putting it at risk of going through there, but it's adding an extra 5 days onto the journey. So that's causing a little bit of a spike around the sort of pricing on the containers and the likes. The other issues that we're starting to see now that weren't necessarily as big an issue over the last couple of years is the living wage increases. When you look at some of the manufacturers that put a lot of the products together in the UK, the living wage increases are putting their costs up quite considerably because it's not necessarily the people on the living wage. What they'll generally do is they'll work with the people on the living wage, and they'll have people who are more productive in their output who will be on a slightly higher salary. So the ones who are going up with the living wage, they have to reflect that with a lot of the other people within the factories and the operations. So again, that is a challenge. And I can't remember on the third one, so I'll just move on. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there we go. It was the boiler tax. So again, I'm not too sure who's been talking about the boiler tax. I've seen what's going on with the boiler tax. So these are sort of individual spikes that we're seeing that people are talking about. The boiler tax has been an interesting one because basically, for those of you who don't know, the government's put a tax or levy in place for any boiler manufacturer to say you need to be producing 4% of your boiler turnover of air source heat pumps. Now, if you don't produce 4% of your turnover, so say they produce and they sell in the the UK domestic market, 100,000 boilers, they're expected to sell 4,000 air source heat pumps because what they wanted to do was they wanted to kickstart that market and get people transacting on that. What's happened on the bottom, and if they don't do that, they will be fined £3,000 for every air source heat pump that they don't sell. So say, for example, they didn't sell 100 air source heat pumps, that'd be £3,000 times 100. So that's been a big cost that all the boiler manufacturers had a look at. And funnily enough, they all decided at the same time that they were then going to put an increase onto every boiler. So you've probably been seeing this of late, that you've been charged an extra, it ranges between 80, 90 quid to an extra £120 per boiler. And what they've said is, we're going to do that for all of those, and that's going to pick up our fine that we're going to get. We're going to put it away in account, and then we're going to pay it on to the government. I wasn't going to talk about this because there was then an article in The Guardian a few weeks ago that said the government had decided to scrap the boiler levy, and it's all going to go back to normal. So we were then talking to the supply chain around, right, great, you've put that money aside, you're now going to pay it back to the customers. The worrying thing now is when it comes out as an article in The Guardian and then it goes quiet again for another few weeks, is that going to be a change, and is that going to be a U-turn? So we're still now back onto the working with the boiler manufacturers around those fines and rebates of them coming back, because they've all based it on a worst case scenario. If they then sell 3,000 heat pumps, they shouldn't be sitting on that money. It should be coming back as rebates and various mechanisms around it. So yeah, I think the general gist with this is we are seeing costs coming down. It is starting to now, the supply chain are now starting to talk to us about some reductions. We've actually seen some reductions on windows quite recently. We've had a 10% reduction on windows from one of the manufacturers, and that's because, going back to the starting point, that demand isn't there anymore. That demand isn't, and they're now looking to win extra work. So we are expecting to see a few more price downs. But bear in mind, there are some of these fluctuations or spikes in activity that are causing people to look at things in different ways. And some manufacturers, I'm sure, are still coming to you with increases at various times. So moving on to contractors, I think generally for the type of stuff that you guys do, we've just spoke about all the stuff that you're taking in-house. We work with a lot of the external contractors, and it is more around the specialists. So we work with a couple of different types of contractors. We work with the direct delivery ones, and that's the ones who have all the teams in-house and will deliver in-house. They were quite quiet during the last few years. They haven't been coming to us with price increases. They have been feeling some of those price increases because the cost of living and the cost for operatives, and just the usual ones, the wages, the fuel, the materials, if they're not managing the supply chain in the same sort of way. But what we do find with a lot of the direct delivery ones, the ones that we tend to work with only really work in social housing. Now, that makes a big difference, because what people have been doing is chasing the work into new build, into residential, and the ones who've done that have been getting paid a lot of money in those other sectors, and have then started to look at, well, actually, what's the viability of working in social housing at this moment in time? That's been great over the last couple of years. We're now starting to see that change because the other markets are starting to reduce considerably. And we've been talking about that for some time. There was a lot of gangs of subcontractor roofers who were going to new build because it was easier not having to work in properties with residents. It was nice and easy to just go and do. And there was a lot of new build to be finished off. As you'll see in the news at the moment, there's not a lot of new build starting now, and that sector is starting to drop down. Residential, we've got colleagues from Jewson, the counter sales, from what I gather, is massively down at the moment because people aren't buying stuff. It has gone down, and those two sectors have really dropped off, the residential and the new build. And that's meaning that a lot of the, going into the second sort of contractors, the subcontracted delivery, they were struggling a lot over the last few years because the subcontractor, with that market being so buoyant, haven't been available. So if they were doing, their models were to put tenders in and then look for the subcontractors to actually deliver it, there's a lot of them that caught a cold and couldn't deliver a lot of those types of schemes. So the direct delivery ones didn't see it as much as a problem. The subcontracted ones, it was, but those subcontractors are now becoming more available. And that demand shift is, we are seeing over into the refurb market, into the social housing sector. It's a very buoyant sector now because it's the only one that's really going. But it is a wider sector than it was previously. The amount of retrofit works now that we're looking at is huge, and that's bringing in the private sector properties. A lot of the funded stuff isn't just targeted at social housing, it's targeted at private sector, which is meaning that these contractors who are generally doing the retrofit works in the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund are moving on to the private sector and working through that as well. And that is causing us an issue with skills gaps. There's a lot of stuff at the moment where we're working with the heating contractors, and I'd be interested in your guys' feedback around this. There's a lot of skills on gas engineers, and is that being converted over to air source heat pumps, to ground source heat pumps? We're seeing quite a lot of training available. We've been doing some work with City and Guilds who've got a lot of funding now, and if anybody wants to talk about that later on, I'm happy to do so, where they're subsidising large percentages of upskilling, where it is working away from gas engineers onto air source heat pumps and that type of technology. But there is certainly a gap there at the moment, and it is about going back to the starting point, getting people who are distant from the labour market into those sorts of roles, because there's a lot of it about at the moment. And the final bit on the contractor side, there's a lot on the commercial side when it comes to retrofit, which again is going to be a challenge going forward. There's a lot of public sector decarbonisation fund is probably equivalent to the housing side, and there's a lot of work that's going to be done on, and that's why I've put a field worth of PV rather than a PV on a roof. Because again, if you can go and install a field's worth of PV, it's perhaps more viable than going up and doing many roofs for equivalent sort of value with that. Again, interesting marketplace at this moment in time. So yeah, just to summarise on that, from the supply chain and the contractor side, demand is down in new build and residential, demand's up in retrofit, costs are down, and that's more the cost to the supply chain, but we are starting to see that move a little bit with some price reductions coming in, and we're seeing very few price increases coming through. Spikes in activity are happening, but at this moment in time, because we've gone from that point which was quite high and we've dropped down, I do feel there's a bit of area to absorb some of those spikes of activities. Certain things can't be done. I was talking earlier to people on my table around some of the contractors now seem very prepared to walk away from contracts, and I don't think that happened a few years ago. But now if it isn't viable, we've seen particularly on the boiler tax, where, the boiler levy, you have to be careful on which terms you use for these different things, that certain contractors are just saying, I can't make it viable unless I can have an increase. There's no mechanism in the contract to have an increase for the boiler levy because it isn't a change in legislation. It doesn't fall within any of those criteria. But the contractors are then saying, well, if I can't have any increase with it to absorb this, I will have to walk away from the contract. And the problem with them walking away from it is any re-tendered price that you get will be inclusive of that levy because everybody's having to pay it. There isn't any option with it. I'll not go through those pie charts because that was just really an illustration of the demand that we're sort of seeing. And our demand has stayed very constant apart from the retrofit, which has jumped up by about 30%. So, moving on, that was the supply chain and the contractor side. Moving on to fleet, it was interesting to talk about your fixed prices on the fleet over the next few years. And I'd probably go back to the perfect storm analogy around what's happened in the fleet market over the last few years. The fleet market has been really crazy in that components have been a problem. So I've not mentioned the war in Ukraine as well as COVID, but the war in Ukraine was very problematic when it came to semiconductor chips and certain components that go into the majority of vehicles. A lot of them were manufactured in the Ukraine and people weren't ready and expecting to be able to source them elsewhere and do something different with it. So you had reports at the time that there was demand there for vehicles because there was so much activity going on everywhere, but the lead times were getting higher and higher because they just couldn't finish these vehicles off. I've heard reports of certain manufacturers where they were actually bringing in white goods to take the semiconductor chips out to finish off vehicles because the penalties were so high of them not being able to deliver those vehicles. And it did, again, give that perfect storm where everybody wanted them and it was very hard to get hold of them. You could get hold of some because there were changes where people had ordered them and then they cancelled the order and there were certain ones. But to order them from the factory was very problematic and you were on about 16-month lead times at that point. Fast forward it to 2024, things are improving, availability is improving, the semiconductor chip isn't an issue anymore, they've started sourcing it and they've set up factories in other places so they can get hold of those. And we're now starting to see order books opening. We've had a few problems over the last year where order books open, but only for a short amount of time. And if you didn't get your order in, it closed then, and you're having to move from manufacturer to manufacturer. But now it is getting better. We're seeing lead times getting better. We're now talking of 6-month lead times when we're up to 12 and 18 months from factory. And vehicles are available, and that is over multiple manufacturers, where certain manufacturers thought it was practically impossible to get at one point. And enhanced terms are being offered. When the lead times come down and those demands aren't necessarily there, we are now starting to see better terms being offered on a weekly basis and enhancing the terms for the actual purchase of the vehicles. Don't get me wrong, I think there is some volatility, and you've done really well to fix a price for 5 years. The actual pricing on the vehicles is quite straightforward in that you buy that vehicle or they buy that and they've got the finance agreed with it. But elements such as insurance are the big issues at the moment, and you'll have seen your own premiums going up and down. And that's the bit that is quite hard to assess and to work out. Just moving on to EV, obviously there was some discussion about EV, and we had a few clients who came to us and said, right, we want to do 100% EV. And the first question would be, are you sure you want to do 100% EV? Have you assessed whether they would be suitable for EV and that you could have your full fleet of EV vehicles? And on the back of that, people have done a lot of assessments to basically, similar to the way you described it before, you look at the mileage, you look at certain operatives, have they got a drive, have they got a desire to have a charge point, and you tie it into which vehicles are suitable to be EV. One of the things that's coming out of the market at the moment that I thought would be useful to raise is the residual values when it comes to EV. Now, there's a couple of murmurs from certain organisations that are losing a lot of money when it comes to residual values. And that was mainly because when they put them together, they didn't really know how much the electric vehicles were going to be worth at the end of life cycle. And they're now being valued at much lower than they anticipated. So obviously they've been gearing their leases up over a residual value of X that is now turning out to be something very different. So I think it's going to be interesting whether, it sounds to me like there'll be a bigger difference again going to the purchase and the actual lease prices going forward, because as those residual values are realised, people start to understand exactly what that looks like, and that'll be reflected in future leases. So again, if you started out a fleet previously on a fixed price, you've done really good with that. I think the pricing on diesels is going to get better as we go forward. Electric vehicles, it's going to be a little bit unsure until those residuals start to really until we understand them a little bit better. So, the bit that everybody's been waiting for, on the Procurement Act. So, very quickly through, for those of you who don't know, there's been some legislation that's been going through, so they've been debating over the last couple of years the procurement bill, which has now got royal assent and is going to become an act, and that's due to go live in October of this year. So there's quite a few changes around mechanisms, around how you go out to market, that I'm not really going to talk about today. They're going to be interesting for your procurement teams in different ways. And there's little bits, like I mentioned, we have dynamic purchasing systems that we use at the moment. That's going to be renamed as a dynamic market. There's going to be options for open frameworks, which is something that's never happened before, that aren't actually open at all. It just means that after 4 years you'll be able to recheck it, and then it could go for another 4 years. Now, in my humble opinion, you might as well just go back out to market after those 4 years. So the bit I did want to mention was the bit that could apply to you guys, and that's around the contract management. Now, contract management, when it came to procurement in the previous acts, has always been the procurement team would do it, it'd hand it on to you guys, and you deliver it. Now, they've changed that to be contract management is legally within the definition of the actual procurement activity. And what that means is there's going to be implications that follow on from that procurement all the way through the delivery of it. And I was talking to Russell before, I think it might be something that you want to do a little bit more on a future event. But one of the bits just to mention from that is the noticing regime. So the noticing regime was previously quite straightforward in that you put a contract notice out when you were going out to market so everyone could see it and everyone would know about it. You might put a pin prior to that, but then you'd put a contract award to say, right, we've done the exercise, this is who's been successful with the exercise. That is now going to extend into lots and lots of other areas. So there's going to be requirements around performance against KPIs, poor performance, modifications of contracts. All of these are going to be notifications that either you guys or your procurement team are going to have to publish to everybody, so everybody can see that sort of transparency. Don't worry too much, it is on values, and I haven't put the values in there, so it's only over certain values that you have to do this, but it's just to make you aware that it is something that is going to be coming and is going to be a little bit different. The other bits, contract expiry and payment compliance notice for both value and timing. That's an interesting one, because that's going to be, you have to confirm that you have paid people within the 30 days or the time restraints of that particular contract, which again is something that will show up very clearly, bad payers and people who aren't processing things through. And we have a lot of work that we do with councils, and because it goes through so many stages, that a lot of the time that might go past that 30 days or what's on the actual invoice. So again, we'll be working with them to streamline that, to make sure that it is covered off going forward. And the last one is, I've put in there social value outcomes. Again, there's more requirements in the new Procurement Act around that social value activity that needs to be put into those contracts and those procurements. And it's certainly something that needs to be considered going forward. And that was, I always get told I speak far too quickly, but that was a quick tour around what's going on in the supply chain and the market at the moment.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. Bring us back on time. Brilliant presentation again, and I think it really did give us a really good understanding of where procurement is in the marketplace. Any questions, please, for Matt? Anybody? No? Look. Sorry? Silence, yeah. You stunned everyone, Matt, I think, yeah. And I think the bit about the procurement has obviously killed people off. No, not really. No, if there are no questions, then I'd like to show our appreciation to Matt and thank you for a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.